Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help. Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who've experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are talking about non-reported cases of sexual assault. My name is Emilie Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Education Coordinator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. With me today, I have Melissa Ashton. Melissa uses she, her pronouns, has been in the field of victim services since 2001, and she began her career primarily supporting survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence through the criminal justice system. Melissa also served as a campus-based advocate for nearly 10 years, where she worked with survivors of all types of crimes. Through her work at the Florida Council Against Sexual Violence, Melissa has worked with survivors on their civil legal needs under the LAV grant, and has also provided technical assistance to Florida advocates, law enforcement, and prosecutors. She is currently the Director of Programs, and in this role provides training and technical assistance to Florida's 31 certified sexual assault programs, including the VSC, around the state. Melissa also works on PREA, or the Prison Rape Elimination Act, issues and continues to train advocates. In her free time, Melissa enjoys spending time with her family and training for her next race. So Melissa, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
And I also have returning Rhonda Wilson. So Rhonda uses she, her pronouns and has been a part of the VSC team for over 12 years. She has 3 graduate degrees, a Master of Human Services, an MBA, and a Master in Administration of Justice and Security. Rhonda has over 30 years of experience in criminal and military justice. She served in the U.S. Navy for 20 years. After retiring from the Navy, Rhonda worked as the director of a residential re-entry center for inmates transitioning from federal prisons. Rhonda's goal is to engage the entire community in activities that prevent sexual assault and crime. So Rhonda, thank you as well for coming back onto the podcast. We're excited to have you.
Thank you for having me again, Emilie.
And as a really brief introduction, sexual assault is one of the most underreported crimes ever. And today we are going to chat about the many barriers survivors may face when it comes to reporting, the different options survivors have, and the resources available to them, whether or not they want to report, and why it is important for survivors to make choices that are right for them on their healing journey. So with that, I like to just throw it out there to kind of define what exactly is a non-reported case of sexual assault.
A non-reported case is when an individual makes the decision that they do not want to report it to the police. And it's that person's right to make that decision. It can always be, there's always these different reasons not to, but we can go into that in later on and why individuals do not want to report it.
Absolutely. And I also was kind of curious, we said that it's one of the most underreported crimes. But what is the percentage of sexual assaults that are not reported?
Approximately 69% of the sexual assaults are not reported to the police.
Wow. Yeah, I think that's really staggering. And what do we exactly mean by report? Is it reporting specifically to the police?
What we mean by report is that they actually talk to somebody in law enforcement and they make a report, and they tell the investigating officer or the police officer what happened in details of the sexual assault. Now, if they don't report it, then that's okay, because that's everybody's right not to report it. But that's what's considered a reported case, and what a non-reported case is.
So when you say law enforcement, it could be anyone like a detective or a patrol
Yes.
officer or something like that.
Patrol officer, a deputy. So I'm going to be using police throughout the podcast so that, everybody understands who I'm talking about.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that there are a lot of reasons why survivors choose not to report. So
Right.
what are some of those reasons why someone may decide not to report the sexual assault to the police?
There are several reasons of what I've seen. Some of it could be like they feel like that the rape was a personal matter. They don't want to relive the trauma because they have to tell their story numerous times to different individuals. Their fear of not being believed, especially by police and by family members and by friends. They fear that the perpetrator will not be held accountable for their actions. Sometimes the criminal justice system can be intimidating, and sometimes individuals are just not willing to go through that process. A lot of times it's a distrust of the police. Their fear of the retaliation of the perpetrator or the offender. They self-blame themselves for the circumstance that surrounds the sexual assault. And they just want to forget that it ever happened. They just want to move forward and forget that it ever happened.
Yeah, Rhonda, I think you hit on some really high points there as to why survivors don't report. I think the being believed one is the main one that survivors fear. No one's going to believe me. Maybe the perpetrator said that to them during the assault. Maybe it was a friend and they feel like they have some responsibility in the situation. And if they do report, what happens to their circle of friends? Being blamed by law enforcement, or, those questions that lead to victim blaming and feeling even more blamed based on, those questions that are asked of them. And it also a lot of times depends on who the perpetrator is. Is it their employer? Could they lose their job? Is it their landlord? Could they lose their housing? All of these factors play into why survivors don't report. And another one is, when survivors experience an assault, they lose that control. That control is taken away from them. So then they're thrust into another system where they don't have control over what's happening next. They don't, trying to predict and prepare for a system that you don't know a lot about can be really intimidating. And I think for a lot of survivors, as you mentioned, that feeling of wanting to move on, they need to focus on their basic needs. And right now, reporting would take too much energy away from their medical needs or their day-to-day needs. And they just can't deal with another thing right now.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you both kind of sharing all these different barriers. It's obviously really overwhelming, or can be overwhelming, for a survivor to make that choice. You mentioned too that it could have been, for example, a friend. And I always like to mention in my trainings that 8 out of 10 times, it is the perpetrator is someone that the survivor actually knows. So that makes sense that could also be a barrier to reporting. And you also mentioned, you brought up the word control, because as we talk about a lot on this podcast, that this crime is really a crime of power and control. So when it comes to reporting, do you think that we as a society kind of pressure survivors into reporting this to the police?
Oh, absolutely. One of the questions is, why aren't you reporting this? And it shouldn't be like that. That's kind of, cornering that individual, the survivor, into trying to make a decision right now, this second, when they really can't make that decision. They rather sit back and try to process that.
Would you agree, Melissa?
I would. I think as a society, we're hardwired to believe that if a crime really occurred, that you report it to law enforcement. And if it didn't, you don't. So we don't really leave a whole lot of room for other options or other possibilities of what a survivor may be dealing with. And this places the responsibility on the survivor to prove that they were a victim. And saying things like I would or you should, when we really don't know how we would respond in that situation.
I'm so glad you brought that up because, yeah, I think I love the way that you said to have to prove that you're a victim when someone already has gone through probably one of the worst things they'll ever go through. And then they have to prove that it happened. That could be really, really just heartbreaking. In addition to that, do you think that there's this idea of society being like, it's kind of your responsibility to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else? Do you hear that a lot as far as a pressure to report?
Absolutely. It is. And I'm glad you asked that question. That's a really good question. As a society, we need to recognize that not every survivor responds the same to trauma. And we need to allow them time and space to process their trauma and determine what they need to focus their energies on in order to heal. The survivor should not focus their healing on solely, being the one responsible for holding that perpetrator accountable. And they shouldn't be responsible for proving their victimhood or catching criminals. They should be responsible for taking care of themselves and making sure they're able to heal and function from a trauma.
Absolutely. I'm really glad that you mentioned that. And again, since this is about, power and control, us kind of pushing them into doing this reporting process, which is part of some people's healing journey, but not everyone's. It could be kind of pulling away that power once again, right? And it can be for, it's not everyone's healing journey. And we like to say that survivors are the experts of that, and they should be in charge of that for sure. But at the same time, sometimes there is mandated reporting. So what is a mandated reporter, and when does a sexual assault need to be reported in the state of Florida?
Well, mandated reporting means if you're under the age of 18 and you call our hotline or you talk to an adult about somebody, sexually abusing you, or you had sexual assault, we are required by law to report that to DCF. All right. And so anybody under the age of 18, we have to do that. 18 and older, that is your right, whether you want to report it or not.
And also I had a question. So this would have to be reported to the DCF, not to the police. Is that correct?
Well, we automatically report to DCF if we believe that the police is not involved. But it has to be reported, even though within our agency here in Central Florida, even though we might meet with the client or meet with the survivor and they're under the age of 18, we still call it in and report it, whether we believe that the police has reported it or not. We just want to make sure all bases are covered and then make sure that it's reported, because if that child needs to be removed from that home, DCF needs to know about that.
I understand. Okay. So whether or not we know if it's already been reported by another entity, at the end of the day, it's our duty to report it to DCF. And from what I understand, isn't everyone a mandated reporter yes. in the state of Florida? Yeah, that's surprising, because a lot of times we hear like, oh, if you're a teacher, if you're a, healthcare provider, but in the state of Florida, I think everyone is a mandated reporter of sexual abuse,
yes,
which is sexual assault happening to children, anyone younger than 18. Is there anyone else that we would have to report a sexual assault?
Absolutely. Vulnerable adults. Absolutely. Persons with identified disabilities. We have to report that to DCF also.
Oh, and you would report that to DCF, not to the police. Okay. Understood. So with that, when a survivor is not a child or a vulnerable adult, is an advocate a confidential resource for them?
Yes.
And why is that important?
It's important that we have confidentiality in the state of Florida. We have that confidentiality of the Florida Statute 960, Chapter 960, which mandates that non-reporting victims of sexual battery are entitled to the same level as reporting victims, including the collection, storage of forensic evidence kits. in our counties, the sheriff's office stores the non-report kits, so that they store them for as long as they need them, as of right now.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off of a little of what Rhonda said there. And yeah, under Florida statute, sexual assault advocates are confidential at rape crisis centers. So it's really important, I think, to get that out there to folks so that they understand that, we do have law enforcement based advocates. We have state attorney based advocates. They do not enjoy the same confidentiality and privilege that rape crisis center advocates do in the state of Florida. And that's critical for folks to know, so that when they are ready to report, they can maybe talk through some ideas with someone who is confidential versus someone who is not.
And we have, the community victim advocates, which in our agency here in Central Florida at the Victim Service Center, our main focus is the survivor. That's who we care about, and that's who we are there to protect and have them process along with us on their journey. We're the ones that will assist them along the way in the hope of the journey and on the healing process.
I'm so glad that law exists because obviously having that confidential resource can be really integral for someone's healing journey, someone that they can talk to where that won't be shared unless they give consent to share that information, right? And in what cases would a survivor want to consent to share the information that they spoke with between an advocate and themselves?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that. We have to get a written consent to disclose, which is a release of information. If there's a suspicion of the physical, sexual, or emotional abuse of a child, an elderly person, or a disabled adult, we have to. It won't be, the confidentiality won't be protected on that because we know the mandate reporting. If there's a threats to harm oneself or harm others, the confidentiality is not protected. If the court order is subpoena of their records, it's not covered. Research audits and program evaluations, it's not protected, but they do have to sign that they would not repeat anything of any files or if they recognize anybody in our clientele. And if anyone who does not work for a certified rape crisis center, the confidentiality is not protected, as Melissa said a while ago.
Absolutely. And is there ever a time where it would make sense where a survivor wants the information to be released, like in a court of law or something? Or
well, if it's court ordered, a lot from my experience, what I've had has happened probably about 2 times since I've been at the Victim Service Center, is that the judge that's presiding over the case will do an in-camera review of the file, and then he or she will make that decision whether he or she will disclose it to the defense attorney or to the prosecutor.
And I'm not an attorney, and I certainly don't claim to be, but I've heard it explained by attorneys before to survivors that the privilege is theirs. The privilege lies with the survivor. So they are the ones to determine when they are willing to give up that privilege and have, an advocate speak on their behalf.
That's awesome. Thank you for shedding light on that. So I also wanted to ask, a little bit more about the forensic exam or the rape kit that you were mentioning, Rhonda. So we talked a lot about how there's so many different barriers as to why survivors do not report. And with that, we have this thing called a forensic exam, and we'll get to more of what exactly that looks like. But essentially, I wanted to ask, can survivors still be entitled to a free forensic exam or rape kit, which is within 120 hours of a sexual assault occurring, if they choose not to report?
Yes, they get, absolutely. It's a free forensic collection exam for anybody who says that they were sexually assaulted within the 120 hours. Absolutely. It's totally free.
And why is it important that this option exists for survivors, whether or not they want to report in that moment?
If they don't want to report it, at least they have time to think about it. The importance of the forensic collection is preserving the evidence. And once that's preserved, then the survivor has as much time as they want, up to about 7 to 8 years in the state of Florida, to report it. But at least the evidence is preserved. That's what's important. Because a lot of times at that moment in time, especially on non-reports, the survivor is not ready to deal with the police, or they're not ready to go down that road yet. And they need time to be able to, sleep on it, process it, because they're exhausted from all the, from sexual assault. And it brings trauma on the body of the individual, psychologically and physically.
Absolutely. Melissa, would you agree that, having this option is so integral for a survivor?
It is. And it was passed in Florida in 2007. So, and I know that we've had lots of non-reporting folks, convert their kits to reporting, because they're given that time and space. That evidence is there. They're ready to move forward with their case. The evidence has been preserved. So, the law enforcement can investigate, prosecutors can prosecute. So it really gives survivors another critical option in a time when they're trying to deal with so much, to, take the time that they need to process the events that have happened, and then to make that decision that is right for them.
Hey, I want to piggyback on that, what Melissa said. We were talking about non-reports converted over to reports. In our agency, I look back about 3 years, from October 2018 to October 2021. And I pulled our cases and found out that we had 1,105 cases that we collected evidence on. Out of that, 126 were non-reports, which was 11%. But what's really nice is, out of that 126, 21 converted over. So that was 17% of those non-reports were converted over to reports.
That's incredible. It shows again that, having as many options as possible and knowing the options for survivors is really what being survivor focused is all about, right? So again, having the option of choice is super, super empowering. And I think that that's great that we have this option of, hey, you only have 120 hours after a sexual assault occurs, because that's just how DNA evidence collection works. But you don't have to decide in this moment if you want to go down the path of reporting. You can decide that later on. So I think that that's really comforting, or could be comforting for a lot of people, so that they can do what's best for them. I also wanted to talk a little bit about, Rhonda, if you wanted to touch on this Florida statute about non-reported cases being entitled to the same level of care as reported cases. Why is that important that statute exists?
It's important because it's a choice for an individual, or it's a choice for a survivor. Like we said before, not everybody wants to come forward, and we right now, nationwide, it's 69% of individuals. 69% will not report it, but we need to be able to collect the evidence, and the statute's in place for that reason, so that survivors would come forward and at least get the evidence collected, and then later on make that decision whether they want to move forward with that or not.
Yeah, essentially, you will be receiving the same level of attention and care. The victim advocate will be there. The same nurse we'll talk a little bit about soon as well. Whether or not you choose to want to report, it's the same case. It's the same process.
Yes.
And I wanted to talk a little bit about that process. So what is typically involved in the forensic exam?
What's involved is our victim advocates, crisis counselors, will sit down and talk to the survivor and explain the process. And what the process is, they're going to explain that the nurse is going to ask you very direct questions, and how you answer it is indirectly going to tell where the sexual assault nurse examiner is going to look on your body to search for evidence. And that's what she's there for, is to collect the evidence from your body, because your body is technically considered a crime scene. So she needs to have the guidance of being able to collect the evidence from the survivor's body. And what she does is she uses a swab. For females, it's a pelvic exam. She'll collect evidence there. She'll collect evidence from the clothing. She'll bag up the clothing. She will also make sure she tags everything, make sure all the evidence is dry before she packages it up. And then she makes sure that evidence never leaves her sight during the collection, during the drying, during the packaging. And then she stores it in a locker, so that chain of custody is not broken, and that law enforcement will come and pick up the evidence from the facility.
Okay, so that kind of involves the chain of custody that we were talking about there to make sure that the evidence is preserved and able to be used if the person chooses to report or not. I had a quick question as well. Throughout the process, do survivors have to do all of the forensic exam? Can they choose to be like, hey, I don't want to do that, but I'll do this?
Sure. It's an option. A survivor can do all the forensic collection exam. They can do partial, or they don't have to do it at all. It's up to that. That's their option. That's their choice.
Absolutely. And speaking of that choice, how can an advocate help a survivor decide whether or not to get a forensic exam? So I heard you kind of talking a little bit about they can share the process and things like that. Can someone call our helpline and check in on what that is? And how can an advocate really assist with that?
What we do is we educate the survivor or the caller that's calling our helpline. And we explain to them what the process is. We lay it all out there for them, step by step, what to expect, approximately how long it would take. And then we let the survivor make that decision.
Because it can be a few hours, can't it?
Yes, it can be anywhere from a couple hours to 3 to 4 hours. It's depending, when we can get the survivor in, we get the sexual assault nurse examiner there, advocate there, and we all meet up and we go through the process of collecting the evidence.
And we talked a lot about how there are certain body parts, obviously, and involved in taking the clothing and things like that. So I can imagine, can this be rather triggering for a survivor who's just been experienced a sexual assault? We call it an acute case when it's within 120 hours. So can it be kind of triggering for them?
It can be triggering, but you know what? We will take our time with that survivor. If the survivor says stop, we will stop until they're ready to take a breath, or they're ready to proceed, or if they're ready to stop altogether. The option is all theirs. We put the ball in their court and they make all the decisions along the way.
Yeah. And that kind of leads me to this other point where essentially getting the survivor's consent for the exam. So if they are a minor, who signs off on the consent?
What happens with us is that if we have a minor involved, usually we have a parent or a legal guardian with them, and then they will sign off on it. But the bottom line is this: even though that the legal guardian or the parent will sign off on it, it's still up to the minor to decide whether they want to go through the collection or not. If they do not want to, the sexual assault nurse examiner will not proceed.
Absolutely.
It's all about the option and the choice.
Yeah.
For that survivor.
Absolutely. And I know that it's so integral that we do get their, written consent. And is that consent kind of revisited with the same nurse as they keep going through the process?
We always, I know with the SANEs or with their sexual assault nurse examiners, they always ask, I'm going to do this. Are you okay with this? And they always ask, they make sure that the survivor is as comfortable as possible throughout the process.
Absolutely. And, speaking of consent, as the education coordinator, I talk a lot about consent in my trainings to help prevent sexual assault. And we talk a little bit about alcohol and how alcohol removes your ability to consent. So with that, how does alcohol ever play a factor in a survivor's ability to consent to a forensic exam?
Yeah, so I know, so I worked as a college campus-based advocate for almost 10 years. And I mean, as everyone knows, alcohol is definitely on the scene of most college campuses. and is often involved in sexual assaults. I think a lot of times survivors think maybe they were drugged, and oftentimes it's just the alcohol that has affected their ability to remember or, put things together. So it definitely plays a huge role in sexual assaults. Now, with their ability to consent, we did have cases, again, when I was at the university, that, survivors were clearly still too intoxicated to give consent for an exam. And often what we would do in those cases is wait until, they were able to provide that consent, provide them with, comfort, making them comfortable until, they were at a point where we all felt that they could consent to the exam.
That makes a lot of sense, because again, it's so important to always get consent for that, but also just the sensitivity of the issue of this being such an acute case, right? We want to make sure that the survivor is well informed about exactly what the process is going to be, that they're comfortable. And it makes sense that if alcohol is involved, that they wouldn't be able to consent until, some time has passed or something like that. So I appreciate you shedding light on that, Melissa. And you mentioned, your experience working on a college campus and things like that. I wanted to ask either you, Melissa, or you, Rhonda, whoever would like to jump in. Are there any case studies that you wanted to talk a little bit about?
Well, I do. I've had some cases in the past where, the person's trying to decide whether they want to report or non-report, and I laid out all the options to that survivor. And one of their concerns was, and Melissa brought this up earlier too, but the reasons that they're trying to decide whether they want to report or not is because if they report it, how's that going to affect them in their family and their friends? Like, I had cases where the survivor says, I can't report this. That's my brother-in-law. He's the one that did this. How's my sister going to handle that? How are we going to handle this on holidays? And, things like that. And I've had cases where I don't know whether I want to report this or not, because that's my boss's boyfriend, and I work for her. And, it can be tricky. And, and that's the reason why, like with these individuals who are survivors who want to be non-report, they have to have time to really think it through because of what's going to happen once that comes out. Because once that comes out, there's no taking it back. It's out there in the family, family and friends are going to know if the survivor tells them about that, because it's certainly not going to hear it from a certified rape crisis center that this is happening. So there's a lot of decisions that a survivor has to make, before they decide they want to report it.
Yeah, and I would just echo what Rhonda said. It's not as simple as just deciding to report or not for survivors. They typically have lots of layers of things that they have to look at and feel through in order to decide what's the best decision for them. And it takes a lot of energy. It does, to go through the process and to be involved with the different systems and navigate those systems. And a lot of time, going back to law enforcement, going back to the state attorney's office. And some people just don't have that kind of energy to be putting into something like that. They need to focus that inwardly on themselves, to take care of themselves and to make sure that they're healing. So it's not as simple as people, I think, want to make it out to be.
Exactly. And, and family members and friends don't realize what they're saying to the survivor can be harmful. Like, for example, like what, and we talked about this. Why won't you report to the police? Like, think about this with the case with the brother-in-law. What family member probably say, you probably brought this on yourself, or he wouldn't do that to you, or it's your fault, or it's been so, you wanted it, or I don't believe you, and those are very harmful sayings to survivors, very harmful, and it's, or if you weren't, using drugs or alcohol, you wouldn't have been raped. I mean, these are very, very common sayings that blames survivors, and you can see why they wouldn't want to report it. I mean, there's a lot to really process, and it's like Melissa said, it's very exhausting for a survivor, very exhausting.
Yeah, and when you were talking about families' response, there's also the friends. I remember more than one occasion I had, a sorority member come and, talk about options. And in one case in particular, she decided to report and move forward. And then her entire sorority turned against her. Everyone that she thought were her friends that were there to support her absolutely did not stand by her. And she felt isolated, and like she had lost more than, just one or two friends. She lost her whole, what she considered her family on campus and her community. So it's a lot about weighing, options for survivors and possible unforeseen consequences. And the majority of students I worked with when I was on campus chose not to report because of a lot of these things that they were going to have to navigate as a result of reporting. And not reporting just made it simpler, and they could focus that on themselves and not have to look at all of these exterior stressors that would just be magnified if they did report.
And to add on to that, what Melissa was saying, I mean, think about this, when they report it, the impact of the victim blaming. I mean, this to the survivor, I mean, the survivor could go into depression, substance abuse, low self-esteem, intimate issues, not reaching out for services because they think that they can, work it out by themselves, likelihood of becoming re-victimized, isolation, big time. I mean, that's a great example of being isolated.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you brought up kind of the effects that victim blaming can have on survivors. And I really appreciate that, we're talking about how we, the examples of being not a good supporter, I should say, and kind of showing how integral a support system can be. So with that, we mentioned that telling a survivor that they must report is harmful because it's taking away their power, and it might not be the right path for them. They're weighing all these different options. What are other things that we should avoid saying to someone who discloses their story of sexual violence? I know we highlighted some, but if you have some general tips for anyone listening of what we shouldn't say.
The top one on my list is always avoid the why questions. Don't start a question with why. That just automatically lends itself to victim blaming. Try to reframe a question. So you were telling me this. Tell me more about this. How are you feeling? Tell me about your thought process. More of those kinds of approaches are gonna, make the survivor feel supported and give you more information. Then, those why questions will shut down a survivor because they immediately feel like, oh, well, this person is being judgmental and they're blaming me. So just avoid the why questions, approach it with a non-judgmental attitude, a place of support, is what I suggest.
And I like to add on to that what Melissa said. You'd be surprised how many friends or family call our helpline to ask, how can we help them? You should be able to call your local crisis helpline to find out, what can we do? What services we offer, and present it to the survivor, and then let him or her make that decision whether they want to reach out to us.
That is such a good point, that anyone can call that number, honestly, to get connected. And you should have a local rape crisis center as well if you're tuning in from, not in Central Florida. And you can talk to a victim advocate and see, I just want to know how to be a good supporter. So, avoiding those victim blaming questions and things like that. And going off of that, what are some things that, you mentioned reframing questions, but what are some things that we should say to a survivor going beyond reframing questions?
I think one of the most important things, as we talked about earlier, is that fear of not being believed. So just saying, I believe you. I believe this happened. It's not your fault. You're not alone. How can I support you? And then again, going back to your last question that Rhonda touched on, reaching out to your local program. And in these situations, information is power. So if you can get the information for your friend who's a survivor and provide them with the information, that's going to help them feel like you're someone who's going to support them and be there for them and provide them with information and not pass any judgment and allow them the opportunity to take that control back in their lives to make the decision that's right for them. So all of those, I think, are good things.
Absolutely. Is there anything you want to add on to that, Rhonda?
Yeah, Melissa touched it. That's exactly what you do, and like I said, if all else, call your local rape crisis center helpline, and we will guide you through that process.
Absolutely. And I think that I would just add to that, just simply listening and giving the survivor space as well and having them share whatever they're comfortable with sharing. And I always like to say, if a survivor ever discloses to you a history of sexual assault or sexual abuse, or that they're going through it right now, you're a really special person to this individual. And you should honor that story and know that they saw you as a safe person. And so reacting responsibly is super integral, and just know that whatever you are to that person, remain being that person. If you're their loved one, remain being their loved one. And just know that, we just talked about all the different barriers that survivors face when they, share their story and reporting and all that. So they overcame all of that to share it with you because you felt like a safe person to them. So kudos to you if someone does share that. And then I love the tips that we can, share as well. And then of course, reaching out, that's a great option too, to see what are the things that I can do to be a better supporter to this person. So before we sign up, I think that's a great place to sign up. But before we do, is there anything you would like to bring up that we may not have covered? Or is there anything that you would like to say to the survivors out there?
We're here for you. We're here for you all over the state of Florida. We have 31 programs that are standing ready to talk to you and support you. And you're not alone. We're here for you at any time. We have 24-hour, 7 days a week support lines for you.
And to add to that, if you can't find the local number, you can always call us. I know, Emily, you will give them our phone number and we can guide you. We will either help you through the process, explain the process, or we'll get you your local rape crisis center number.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for being here, both of you. And thank you for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free, confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you are not alone. And thank you so much, Melissa and Rhonda, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.